A nurse was tied to a chair in the workshop she'd inherited from her dead sister, tape across her mouth, surrounded by instruments hanging silent in the dark. They emptied her bag onto the floor, stethoscope, gauze, a hardcover notebook, and they left the notebook where it fell. Outside, the whole town heard the glass break. They turned off their lights. They drew their curtains. In Coldwater Bay, everyone knew the cost of speaking up, and she knew it better than anyone. For 4 years she'd been the one knocking at 2 a.m, the one who stayed after everyone else had gone. 4 men left a stack of papers on her bench, already filled in, missing only a signature. The one in charge still called her sweetheart, the same voice he'd used for 4 years every time he held a door for her at the grocery. What they didn't know was that the debt they were collecting belonged to someone else. A man in Boston, in a room overlooking the harbor, had just learned that someone had sold his name without asking. He didn't drive 3 hours through the fog to save anyone. He came to look at the damage, but when they told him what she did for a living, he stopped for half a second, and no one in that room understood why. If this story stayed with you even a little, leave a like. That's how we know to keep going. Share it with someone who needs to hear that fear is never the final word. And if you believe in stories about courage and quiet strength, subscribe so we can keep telling them together. The darkness inside the workshop smelled of hide glue and rubbing alcohol, 2 things that could never truly blend, and Maren Quill lay between them, her wrists bound tightly to the sides of a wooden chair, counting her own pulse. 92, too high. She had told patients hundreds of times, in the calm voice that came only after 4 years of entering dark houses at 2 o'clock in the morning, to breathe out longer than they breathed in, that the body trusted rhythm more than it trusted words. Now she followed her own advice, and it didn't work. 94. She stopped counting. The tape pulled at the corners of her mouth each time she swallowed, and she realized she was swallowing too often. It was the first sign, one she had written on more forms than she could remember. Patient swallowing repeatedly. Patient avoiding eye contact. Patient says she fell down the stairs. She tilted her head toward the door. They hadn't locked it. There was no lock to use. They had only slid a wooden bar through the handle from the outside, crude and temporary. The kind of thing people did when they intended to return through that same door. On the workbench, the stack of papers lay beside the darkened desk lamp, arranged neatly, every edge aligned with the edge of the table. Someone had taken the time to straighten them. That detail chilled her more deeply than the concrete floor beneath her feet. Her canvas bag lay tipped over nearby, its contents spilled in a trail across the cement. Stethoscope, rolled bandages, bottle of alcohol, scissors, and the hardbound notebook lying face down. Its spine turned toward the ceiling. They had searched it. They had opened the bag, turned it upside down, and left the notebook exactly where it had fallen. She stared at it for a long time in the darkness, and a thought came to her slowly, like water seeping through a ceiling. They hadn't taken it because they already knew what was inside. They knew, and they weren't afraid. Across the street, behind the cotton curtain of the bakery, Ilsa Pemberton stood with one hand resting on the cream-colored telephone, her index finger one knuckle away from the numbers. She had heard the glass break. The entire row of shops had heard the glass break. 3 weeks earlier, at 2:15 in the morning, she had called Maren's mobile phone, and Maren had arrived 11 minutes later, sat on the edge of her bed, said very little, simply held her wrist and counted, then held her hand and continued holding it for 40 minutes, until her breathing slowed and she was finally able to sleep. Just before drifting off, she had told Maren that she was the only person left in this town who was still kind. Now she drew the curtain closed. She did it slowly, with both hands, the way someone lowered the lid of a box. Then she turned off the kitchen light and sat in the chair beside the oven, in the darkness, both hands resting in her lap, and she remained there for a long time without moving. 2 blocks away, at the corner of Ferry Street and Main Street, the patrol car sat close to the curb with its lights off. Hollis Parr sat inside, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other on the radio button. He wasn't reading, he wasn't eating, he wasn't dozing. Anyone looking in from outside would have thought he was waiting for something, but he wasn't waiting. He was working. At 10:47 that night, a call came into dispatch. A young man's voice, breathless, reporting strange noises at the old instrument workshop on Ferry Street. 30 seconds later, the entry no longer existed in the system. No patrol car was sent. No one was notified. The call simply had never happened. And by morning, if anyone asked, there would be a printed record proving that the night had been quiet in Coldwater Bay. Here, silence wasn't cowardice. People often confused the two. Cowardice was being afraid and hiding. Here, silence was a calculated expense, added to the price of everything, paid each month with an envelope or with a curtain drawn at precisely the right moment, and everyone knew exactly how much they were paying. Inside the workshop, Maren raised her eyes toward the instruments hanging on the wall, their curved shadows motionless, and she thought about her hands. How long before her fingers lost all feeling? How much longer before the damage couldn't be reversed? She knew the number. She had spoken that number aloud to other people many times, in a calm voice, inside cold kitchens. Knowing didn't help. Outside, fog from the bay was crawling up the hills. Dawn was still 6 hours away, 3 hours south. In a room on the 22nd floor overlooking Boston Harbor, August Vance Rook stood before the window with both hands clasped behind his back, watching the container ships lying motionless beneath the high-intensity lights. There wasn't much in the room. An oak desk without a single paper on it, one chair, an old rug spread near the foot of the desk, and a dog lying on that rug, 154 pounds of gray skin sagging into folds like an oversized cloak. Someone had draped over him and forgotten to remove. It hadn't begun to rain outside, but the air already smelled of rain. It had started with a routine audit, the dullest task in the organization. One accountant spending 3 weeks with the ledgers before finally knocking on the door because one entry didn't balance. A debt in the Vance books had been sold to a third party. Rook's signature appeared nowhere. The buyer was named Fenwick Draycott, a pawn shop in Coldwater Bay, Maine, a place so small that someone had to look at a map just to find where it was. Silas Booth was in the room when the file was brought upstairs. He hadn't carried it in. He was simply there, leaning one shoulder against the doorframe, his head shaved, his body broad, with the bearing of a man who had stood beside Rook for 15 years and learned how to occupy space without making a sound. Rook didn't turn around. He continued looking at the harbor. Then he asked the debtor's name, and his voice slowed, only slightly, the kind of slowing that people who had worked with him long enough knew how to read. Dead, Silas said. Wendell Voss. Fishing boat accident, 14 months ago. Caught in the net. Body never recovered. The debt was transferred to his fiancée. Rook said nothing for a moment. Transferred to his fiancée, he repeated, not as a question. That wasn't how things were done here. It wasn't kindness. It was arithmetic, because a dead name was a name that couldn't pay, and everything attached to it became worthless. What does she do? Rook asked. Nurse, Silas said. Home visits. She's the only one covering that entire area. And Rook stopped for exactly half a second. No longer. Nothing changed in his face. His breathing didn't falter. Only the hands clasped behind his back opened slightly, then closed again, while the window remained where it was. The ships remained where they were, and no one in the room understood why. Silas didn't notice. Silas was looking down at the file on the desk. Then, before Rook could ask his next question, he asked it for him. Has she signed yet? Rook turned around. It was the first time all evening that he had taken his eyes from the harbor. He looked at Silas for exactly 1 second, the look of a man who had just heard a wrong note in a piece of music he had listened to for 15 years, but couldn't identify which measure contained it. You care? He said. I'm only asking, Silas said. He shrugged. If she's signed, it's over. We tear up the papers and go home. If she hasn't, you have to drive 3 hours over a $7,000 commission for some pawnshop owner in Maine. Rook didn't answer. On the rug, the dog stood up. He didn't hurry. He never hurried. He braced himself on his front legs first, then dragged the rest of his body after them. 154 pounds shifting like a boulder. Someone had pushed off balance. And once he was standing, the entire room knew it. Bruno didn't bark. Bruno hadn't barked once in the 6 years he had spent in this room. He only breathed, a long rasp passing through his sagging muzzle. And that was the only warning that he was about to go somewhere. He walked to the door and stood with his back to them. Facing the hallway, Rook reached for the charcoal wool coat draped over the chair. He put it on slowly, adjusted the collar with 2 fingers, and the ring on his little finger caught a trace of light before going dark again. 3 hours, he said. Silas watched him walk toward the door. What are you planning to do when you get there? See the damage, Rook said. He said nothing more. The elevator doors closed, and in the silence left behind inside the room, Silas Booth stood alone beside the open file, looking down at the line bearing the name of a woman in Maine, and he didn't look at it for long. Inside the workshop, time didn't pass so much as stretch, each minute drawing a little longer like a string tightened beyond endurance. And Marin didn't think about death or injustice or anything grand, because her mind wasn't built that way. She calculated. The rope bit into her wrists about 2 finger widths above the crease, exactly the worst place. Her hands had begun to go numb along the outer edges, the little fingers first, then the ring fingers, the sequence she had seen dozens of times and explained dozens of times in a calm voice inside cold kitchens. 6 hours with rope this tight, and her hands would go completely numb but could still recover. At 12 hours, the real damage would begin. Beyond that, some things wouldn't return, and she knew exactly what they were, knew their names, knew which layers of the hand they occupied. Knowing didn't help. That was the one thing she had never told anyone in 8 years. That knowing didn't help at all. That knowledge was only a way of seeing more clearly what was coming for you. She rotated her wrists as far as she could, barely 1/5 of an inch, and held them there. The darkness inside the workshop wasn't complete. A thin blade of streetlight slipped through the high window, enough for her to see the outlines of the instruments hanging on the wall, their curved shadows motionless, the shoulders, the necks, the scrolls curled like question marks. They belonged to Theodora. Everything in this room belonged to Theodora. Her sister had opened this workshop at 23 with money no one knew where she had found, and she made instruments, and she made them well. And 8 years ago this room had burned. They said it was an accident. There was a paper saying it was an accident, with a signature, a seal, and a date. Marin had believed it for 8 years. Not because she was foolish, because at 19, standing in a hospital corridor beneath fluorescent lights at 4 o'clock in the morning, someone handed her a sheet of paper and told her this was the conclusion, and there were moments in a person's life when all they could do was accept what had been placed in their hands. A scar ran along her left forearm from the elbow to near the wrist, thick and raised, pulling the skin into an uneven line. It didn't have to look that way. In the Portland emergency room that night, they had told her that if she let them stitch it, it would be almost invisible within 6 months. She said no. They asked again, patiently, believing she was in shock. She still said no. Finally, a young doctor sat beside her and told her that if she refused, it would leave a scar for the rest of her life, and she looked directly at him and said that was fine. She let it heal on its own. 8 years later, she was the person who stitched up this entire town. She stitched fishermen with hooks buried in their palms, children who fell from bicycles, elderly people whose paperwork said they had fallen down the stairs. Her stitches were neat and even, and no one had ever complained. And on her own arm was the only wound she had refused to let anyone touch. The fire had taken her sister 8 years ago, leaving Marin to spend the first 4 years in silent paralysis, before she finally became the nurse who stitched up this entire town. Theodora's instrument lay on the workbench, where it had remained for 8 years. Marin had spent 8 years trying to repair it. She wasn't a craftswoman. She was a nurse. She had learned from books borrowed from the Rockport Library, from videos filmed inside workshops in Cremona whose words she couldn't understand, watching only the movements of people's hands and rewinding them again and again. 3 times, she had used the wrong adhesive, synthetic glue instead of hide glue, because no one had told her there was a difference. And each time she had spent 2 weeks scraping it away with a scalpel, little by little. In the 4th year, she had added another crack herself, when her hands trembled after a long night shift. She could close a 2-inch wound in 4 minutes, every stitch perfectly even. She couldn't align 2 pieces of spruce. She looked at the instrument in the darkness, and not far away on the floor, the hardbound notebook lay face down on the cement where they had allowed it to fall. She had stopped writing in it 2 years earlier. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the fog from the bay had crawled all the way up Ferry Street, so thick that the streetlights no longer shone downward but merely hung, suspended as murky yellow orbs about 100 feet apart, and the black car stopped 1 block from the instrument workshop. Rook didn't park in front of the door. He never parked in front of doors. He switched off the engine, sat motionless for 40 seconds listening to it cool, and only then opened the car door. Bruno got out first, not jumping, only sliding down 1 leg at a time, 154 pounds, touching the pavement with almost no sound. And he moved about 5 paces ahead of Rook, the gray mass dissolving into the fog until sometimes all that remained visible were 2 swaying folds of loose skin where he had just passed. The street was silent, not the silence of a sleeping town. Rook had passed through many sleeping towns, and they weren't silent like this. They had refrigerators humming, dogs stirring, someone getting up to use the bathroom, a car starting somewhere at the far end of the street. Here, there was nothing. Every house was dark, every curtain drawn shut, and there was a sameness to it that made him slow by half a step. People didn't close their curtains in perfect unison unless they had learned how. The workshop door stood at the end of the row, its blue paint faded, one pane of glass broken at the lower corner, jagged shards still clinging to the frame. Rook didn't look at the broken glass. He looked at the handle. A wooden bar had been pushed through it, an old ruler found somewhere and wedged between the handle and the doorframe. Crude, temporary, something that had taken less than 10 seconds to arrange. He studied it longer than necessary. They hadn't locked the door. There was no lock. They had only barred it. And people barred a door when they intended to return through that same entrance, when they didn't want to waste time searching for a key at dawn, when in their minds the matter wasn't finished, only paused. On the sidewalk, about one step from the threshold, a small piece of wood lay in the gutter. Rook bent and picked it up. Spruce. Straight, even grain. So fine that it had to be held to the light before it could be seen, the kind of wood that grew at an elevation where summer lasted only 4 months, and a tree needed 200 years to become large enough for cutting. He turned it beneath the murky yellow globe overhead, once, then again. The broken edge was still fresh, still pale, not yet dampened by the fog. He placed it inside his coat pocket. He said nothing to anyone, and there was no one there to hear. Bruno was already standing before the door. He didn't growl, didn't bare his teeth, didn't do any of the things people imagined a 154-pound dog would do. He only turned his head toward the door and held it there. The enormous head tilted 30 degrees, and he remained so still that he looked like something carved and abandoned in that place. Rook placed one hand on the wooden bar. It broke with a single turn of his wrist, cleanly, with a dry crack, and the door swung inward. The smell struck him before the darkness did. Cold, hide glue, and rubbing alcohol. He had smelled the first 2 things in different places throughout his life. Not the third. The third made him stop exactly half a step inside the doorway. A half step no one saw because no one was there, and then he continued. She sat on a wooden chair in the middle of the room, her head bowed forward, her hair falling across one side of her face, her wrists bound tightly to the arms of the chair. She was still breathing. He saw that before he saw anything else. At her feet, on the concrete floor, a stethoscope lay on its side, the 2 steel earpieces spread apart like something unfinished. Rook looked at it. He looked at it longer than he looked at her. Then he approached, lowered himself onto one knee, and the first thing he said wasn't to ask whether she was all right. He didn't ask who had done this. He didn't ask which way they had gone. He lifted the back of his warm hand, pressed it against the edge of the tape at the corner of her mouth, and held it there for several seconds until the adhesive softened, then peeled it away slowly, working from the outside inward, the way someone did when they had done this before. She drew in one long breath and coughed. Then he asked, "Have you signed?" It took her a moment to understand the question. She raised her head, her eyes still struggling to focus, and looked at the dark figure kneeling before her, a man in a charcoal wool coat, whom she had never seen before, and she thought she must have heard him wrong. Then she understood that she hadn't. "No," she said. And that was when his face changed. Not by much. Something around his eyes loosened by 0.5 millimeter, and then was gone. Only then did he remove his coat. He draped the coat over her shoulders before cutting the restraints, and it was the order that caught her attention, because everyone cut the ropes first. Everyone believed freedom was the first thing that had to be given, while this man dealt with the cold before anything else. The wool still held the warmth of his body. Then the knife came out of his pocket. The blade slid between her wrist and the arm of the chair, 2 cuts, and he caught her arm as it fell so it wouldn't strike the wood. He placed 2 fingers against the inside of her wrist, in exactly the right place, with exactly the right pressure, not pressing too deeply. 76, she said. Her voice was hoarse and thin as wet paper. I already counted it myself. Rook's hand stopped. He had heard many things from many people in many rooms. Pleas, lies, names sold cheaply, and he had an answer prepared for all of them. He had no answer for this. He left his 2 fingers there for 1 heartbeat longer. Not to count, then withdrew them. Marin tried to stand and fell. Her legs wouldn't obey her. Her hands still had no feeling, and she went forward onto the concrete on her knees and elbows. He didn't catch her. He saw that she wasn't falling toward the door. She was falling toward the workbench, and she didn't rise again. She crawled on both knees and one forearm toward the pieces of wood scattered across the floor. He didn't help. He didn't stop her. He turned away, facing the broken door. and stood there with his arms resting at his sides, giving her the only thing a man like him could give a woman like her inside a room like this: privacy. Behind him came the faint sound of wood touching wood, one piece at a time. Then came a long breath. It lasted so long that he thought it might never end, drawing out and out like a thread being pulled completely free from a line of stitches. And there were no tears in that breath, no sobbing, nothing at all except an emptiness being forced from someone's chest after 8 years. He still didn't turn around. Only when she had managed to sit upright, cradling a handful of wooden fragments in the fold of the coat, as though she were holding something alive, did he approach the workbench. The stack of papers was still there, its edges parallel with the edge of the table. He picked it up, turned one page, then another, and read quickly, in the way of a man who knew exactly which lines mattered. "This debt belongs to me," he said. "Draycott bought it without authorization. These papers are worth no more than the paper they were printed on. You don't owe him a cent." She looked up at him. "Then I owe you," she said. He was silent. The silence lasted exactly 1 beat longer than it should have, and both of them heard it. "Yes," he said. She didn't react. She only looked down at the hand holding the papers, and she studied it the way she had studied thousands of hands over 4 years, not seeing the person, but the tissue. Across the back of his hand, running diagonally over the knuckles, was an old scar. "You stitched it yourself," she said. "A long time ago," he replied. "Wrong thread," she said. "You used non-absorbable sutures. They should have been removed after 10 days. You left them there until the skin grew over them, which is why the scar is raised now, and why it'll remain raised for the rest of your life." He didn't answer. He set the papers on the table and looked at his hand, turning it over, examining the palm, then the back, and he studied it for a very long time, longer than that scar deserved. He had spent 15 years in a world where people read one another through different signs, through the way someone entered a room, through the place they chose to sit, through whether they looked toward the window. No one had ever read him through a badly placed line of stitches from 11 years earlier, and that was when he understood who stood before him. Not a victim, not a woman bound to a chair who needed to be carried out of the room. Someone who had seen so much damage that damage itself had become a language, and she could read it on everyone, even on him, even now, even before feeling had fully returned to her hands. He turned away so he wouldn't have to remain beneath that gaze, and he walked past the corner behind the workbench, where the thin strip of streetlight couldn't reach. A glass case stood there on a wooden pedestal. He had passed it when he entered and hadn't looked. Now he did. Inside, behind glass coated with a layer of dust so thin and even that it couldn't have settled by accident, was an instrument. Rook stopped. He had seen this before. Not in person. In a hard-bound auction catalog, printed on thick paper in Geneva, left on a coffee table inside a room in London 10 years earlier, already open to that exact page. He stood before the glass case for a long time, and he said nothing. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Mossbacher Funeral Home stood at the end of Cedar Street, with a weathered wooden cross hanging above the door, and a single lamp burning through the night in the waiting room, and when Rook knocked twice, the door opened in less than 10 seconds. Etta Mossbacher didn't ask who they were. She looked at him, looked down at the woman leaning against his shoulder, looked at the 154-pound dog standing behind them in the fog, then stepped back and opened the door wider. She wore a hand-knitted sweater, was 64 years old, with silver hair gathered neatly into a bun, and her hands were as large as a man's. The house smelled of chrysanthemums, that dry, sweet fragrance clinging to the walls, the curtains, and even her clothing, a scent anyone who had encountered it once would recognize for the rest of their life. She wasn't afraid. Rook recognized that immediately and recorded it in his mind the way he would record a number. In a town where every curtain had been drawn shut at the same moment, one woman opened her door at 3 o'clock in the morning to 3 unfamiliar shadows, and she did it with the manner of someone clearing a dining table, because she had seen the final outcome of everything. That was her profession. Nothing inside this room could frighten her anymore. She poured coffee from a pot that had gone cold, reheated it on the stove, and placed a cup in front of Marin, then pulled out a chair and sat across from her, close enough for Marin to hear without Etta needing to raise her voice. "You bandage their hands," Etta said. "I wash their faces afterward. We're only 2 stops along the same road, child, except I'm at the final stop, so I'm allowed to look longer." Marin said nothing. Both hands rested around the coffee cup, and she hadn't taken a sip. She was only holding on to the warmth, and her fingers still carried the color she had seen on dozens of other people and knew by name. Etta didn't ask her about that night. She didn't ask who had tied her up, and she didn't ask whether she had signed anything. She spoke about herself. "I refused to sign," she said. 3 times. Steam rose from the coffee between them. The first time was 4 years ago. An old man from Pike Road. The paperwork said he fell. I looked at what was lying on my table, and I didn't pick up the pen. She told the person who brought the papers that she needed to call someone, that she wanted another person to review them. 3 days later, the file was transferred to a funeral home in Rockport, 70 miles away, and the papers were signed there by someone she had never met, and the funeral was held there as well, and the old man's family had to drive 2.5 hours to attend their own father's service. The second time, she didn't sign either. The third time, she still refused. All 3 times, the files went to Rockport. She took a sip of coffee and set the cup down very gently. "I didn't remain silent, child," she said. "I was replaced. That's how it works here. They didn't threaten me. They didn't burn down my house. They didn't do anything to me at all. They simply went around me. And after the 3rd time, I understood that I could refuse to sign for the rest of my life and never change a thing, because there would always be another desk 70 miles away and another person willing to hold the pen." She continued, her voice still even. "I don't know medicine. I never studied it, but I've done this work for 31 years, and I understand gravity. I know which direction a person falls and what strikes the ground first. And there have been times when I read the paper, then looked at my table, and one word on that paper didn't match what was lying there. Only one word. But one word is enough." Rook stood leaning against the kitchen doorframe, never sitting, and he hadn't spoken once. Etta turned toward Marin and told her what no one had said to her in 8 years. "Listen to me. He doesn't want your workshop. He doesn't need the workshop. He never needed it." Marin raised her head. "The waterfront property," Etta said. "Go outside, stand in the workshop doorway, and look east. What do you see? Water. Look west. What do you see? The road. There are only 3 places like that left around this entire bay that haven't been sold. And one of those 3 is where your sister built her wooden workshop when she was 23 years old, without ever knowing what she was sitting on." No one in the kitchen said anything more. The coffee slowly cooled. Then came the faint scrape of claws against the wooden floor, and Bruno walked in from the waiting room, slowly, never hurrying, and stopped beside Marin's chair. He didn't sniff her. He didn't ask permission. He simply lowered his enormous head into her lap, heavy as a sack of wet sand, and left it there. Marin went rigid. She sat perfectly still, her shoulders drawn upward, afraid to breathe. Then one hand left the coffee cup and found the place it had always known how to find. The first touch in 14 months that didn't require her to be strong. The second knock came at 3:40 in the morning, and this time Bruno lifted his head from Marin's lap before anyone else heard a thing. He didn't growl. He simply raised that enormous head and turned toward the hallway, and Rook had already pushed away from the kitchen doorway before the knuckle struck the wood for the first time. He opened the door. Standing on the steps was a woman about 29 years old, out of uniform, wearing jeans and a wool coat, holding her hat in her hands instead of wearing it, 2 fingers digging into the brim and turning it slowly. Once, then again. "I'm not on duty," she said. Rook didn't invite her inside. He stood in the doorway, blocking it, and remained there, forcing her to continue speaking through the fog, out on the steps, beneath the gaze of a man she had never met before. "I heard something happened here," she said, "and I didn't hear it from dispatch." Rook stepped back and opened the door. That was answer enough. In the kitchen, Etta poured another cup of coffee without asking for whom, set it before the empty chair, and Odessa Hallow sat down with her hat resting in her lap. She spoke quickly, like someone who knew she had only a limited amount of time and had already calculated how to spend it. "The cameras at the docks shut down every night from 1 o'clock until 4 o'clock. They aren't broken. It isn't a power failure. They shut down. There's a command line in the system telling them to turn off, and another command telling them to turn back on. And between those 2 lines are 3 hours when that dock doesn't exist. The same hours, every night. For 4 years. I counted. I sat through 3 straight months of night shifts and counted." Then she tried to retrieve the records. She said that sentence and stopped. Etta set the coffee pot down on the stove and didn't turn around. "The system records every access," Hallow said. "The person's name, the date, the time, which file they opened, how long they viewed it. I knew that. I did it anyway. And the next morning, he knew. He didn't call me into his office. He didn't say one word about it. He only pinned a sheet of paper to the duty board. And from that week until now, I've worked nights. She turned the hat in her hands one more time. He didn't need to threaten me. If he had threatened me, I would have had something I could take to report him. He simply moved me to nights and let me understand it on my own. And I understood. And that was more effective than any threat I've ever heard in my life. Who? Rook asked. Her jaw tightened. Chief Hollis Parr. The name fell into the kitchen like a stone dropped into a well, and for a while no one heard it strike the bottom. Etta didn't look surprised. She wiped her hands on a towel and sat down. Hallow turned toward Marin and continued. Her voice changed now, more urgent, almost pleading. You went into those houses. For 4 years, you were the only one going into those houses. You had to see it. You had to see Mrs. Ashby, Mr. Tatum. You had to see Mrs. Fisk after the warehouse fire. I know you went there because I saw your car parked outside at 4 o'clock in the morning. Why didn't you? Marin looked at her. She didn't answer. She sat there with both hands wrapped around the cold coffee cup and the dog's head still resting in her lap, and she looked directly at Odessa Hallow without saying a word. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then she said, What time do the cameras shut down? Hallow blinked. 1 o'clock, she said. Until 4. Marin nodded slowly. And the workshop door was barred at 10 o'clock, she said, which means they didn't need the cameras for what they did there. Those 3 hours are for something else. I don't know what yet, but it isn't what they did to me. Hallow leaned forward and began talking about the trucks, and Etta poured more coffee, and the earlier question drifted away and sank beneath the conversation, and no one in the kitchen noticed that the woman who had just spent 6 hours tied to a chair had refused to answer a question. Rook noticed. He moved away from the doorway, walked behind Marin's chair, and placed one hand on the wooden back without touching her. I won't call the local police, he said. Marin didn't turn around. I know, she said. Odessa Hallow left at 10 minutes to 4, putting on her hat only after she had stepped onto the front steps, and she walked instead of driving, dissolving into the fog toward Cedar Street with her shoulders drawn slightly inward like someone walking against the wind, though there was no wind. Rook stood in the doorway and watched until there was nothing left to see, and when he turned back inside, Silas Booth was already in the waiting room. He had arrived in the second vehicle, parked somewhere behind the funeral home, and entered through the side door without anyone hearing him, the habit of 15 years. He didn't ask about Marin. That was the first thing. 7 steps away, inside the kitchen, was a woman who had just spent 6 hours bound to a chair, and Silas Booth didn't ask whether she was all right, what she had said, whether she had signed, or whether she knew anything. He stood in the middle of the waiting room beneath the lamp that burned all night, surrounded by evenly arranged rows of wooden chairs, and the scent of chrysanthemums clinging to the curtains, and he spoke about Portland. Miller is in Portland, he said. Rook removed his gloves, one finger at a time. She knows you're here, Silas said. I don't know how she knows, but she knows, and if she's in Portland, she's 2 hours and 40 minutes away, while you're standing exactly 3 blocks from the scene of a debt bearing your name. Rook said nothing. He folded the gloves in half and placed them on the back of a chair. Erase the debt, Silas said. Tear up those papers, call the pawn shop owner, and tell him the debt doesn't exist. He'll understand. Men like him understand very quickly. Then go back to Boston. This isn't worth it, August. It isn't worth 1 night of your time. It isn't worth a mile's worth of gasoline. $7,000 in commission. There are mornings when you lose more than that while drinking coffee. Rook turned and looked at him. He spoke very slowly. He used my name. So what? Silas said. Rook didn't answer. That was the entire answer, and both men knew it. But Silas remained there for another second, then another, waiting, his eyes moving from Rook's face down to his hands and back again, the look of a man weighing something he had weighed many times before and always reached the same number, except this time he hadn't. During those 3 seconds, something passed through the room that no one could touch. Then Silas gave one short nod. Fine, he said. You already know what I think. He took his coat from the back of the chair and walked toward the door. He didn't look toward the kitchen. That was the second thing. Light spilled from the kitchen doorway, and there was the faint sound of a cup touching a saucer, and anyone passing by would have glanced inside. It was instinct. People always looked toward a sound. But Silas Booth walked straight to the door with his eyes fixed ahead, and didn't turn his head by even a single degree. The door closed. Outside, an engine started, revved, then faded toward the highway. Rook remained standing in the middle of the waiting room long after the sound of the vehicle had disappeared. He said nothing. He didn't follow. He didn't call anyone to ask where Voss was. And that was the most remarkable thing of all, because it was the first thing anyone in his line of work would have done after hearing the name of a federal agent less than 3 hours away. He simply stood there beneath the lamp that burned all night, between the evenly arranged rows of wooden chairs, and stared at the door Silas Booth had just walked through. In the kitchen, Etta Mossbacher was washing cups. She couldn't hear anything from where she stood, but 31 years in her profession had taught her to recognize a particular kind of silence. The silence of a room where someone had just walked out and someone else had just made a decision about them. She dried the cup, placed it upside down, and didn't ask. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the fog hadn't lifted, only thinned into a pale white light lying across the surface of the bay, and the lights inside Billy Fisk's boat workshop had been burning for hours, the incandescent bulb hanging from the rafters, swaying whenever the wind slipped through the gaps between the boards. She was sanding a piece of oak when the door opened, and she looked up, and she looked at Marin before she looked at the man standing behind her. "You're earlier than we agreed," Billy said. Her hair was gray as steel, her face weathered by the wind into skin that no longer seemed to have an age, and she set down the sandpaper without brushing off her hands. "I'm not here about your lungs," Marin said. Billy understood immediately. She didn't ask a single question. She merely looked at Rook for exactly 2 seconds, reading the charcoal wool coat and the shoes that didn't belong on a workshop floor covered in sawdust, then turned back to Marin and began to speak. It was what Rook had calculated from the moment they got into the car, and what he would never say aloud. He couldn't open this door. He could open many doors in Boston simply by walking through them. But here he was a stranger in an expensive coat, standing inside a boat workshop at 6 o'clock in the morning, and to Billy Fisk, he didn't exist. The person who existed was the young woman who had sat in her kitchen every month for 2 years, taken her blood pressure, listened to her lungs, never urged her to stop smoking, only spoken the numbers and then sat quietly. "They came with the papers already filled out," Billy said. 3 years ago, in September, 2 men. One carried a briefcase, the other carried nothing. Everything had already been typed. The parcel number, the boundaries, the price, all of it. All I had to do was sign. She picked up the sandpaper, then set it down again. I said no. The following week, my storage shed burned. The one on the north side, where I kept the lumber, the engines, and every tool my father ever owned. It caught fire at 2 o'clock in the morning and burned to the ground in 40 minutes. The fire trucks arrived after the roof had already collapsed. The investigator said it was an electrical short. She stopped. Outside came the cry of a seagull and the sound of water striking the pilings. "Funny thing," Billy said. "I wired that shed myself, in 2009. I ran every foot of cable, wrapped every connection, and installed a separate breaker because my father taught me that wood and electricity were 2 things that should never be trusted near each other. 30 years without a single spark. Then I said no to 2 men carrying papers, and 7 days later it suffered an electrical short. Rook had already risen. He had heard enough, had what he needed, and intended to leave, and he took 3 steps toward the door. Then he stopped. He didn't turn his whole body, only his head. "Which investigator?" he asked. Billy shrugged. "The same man who handles every fire in this county," she said. "The one who signs every report, and every fire is an electrical fault." She said the name. She spoke it in the tone people used for a familiar pothole on the road home, without emphasis, without bitterness, simply as an old fact. And Marin froze. She was holding the cup of tea Billy had given her, and she didn't set it down, nor did she drop it. She only stood perfectly still with both hands wrapped around the cup, her eyes fixed on a point on the workshop floor about 3 feet from where she stood, where an old oil stain had soaked into the wood. Because it was the same name, it appeared in the lower left corner of Theodora's death certificate, on the signature line belonging to the person who had determined the cause, and that paper was inside a tin box on top of the wardrobe in Marin's bedroom, and she had taken it out no fewer than 40 times in 8 years. She had read the word accident. She had read the date. She had read her sister's name typed in capital letters. She had never read the name of the person who signed it. That night, Rook walked out to the northern point, setting out at 9 o'clock without a vehicle or a flashlight, with only Bruno moving about 5 paces ahead of him along the edge of the pine forest that ran parallel to the dirt road. The cannery stood at the end of the point, the corpse of a building made of brick and sheet metal in the 1940s. Every window broken, the roof sagging in the middle, and 4 letters still visible on the peeling sign. County authorities had sealed it 5 years earlier. A sign warning that entry was illegal lay face down on the ground beneath a covering of pine needles. Bruno stopped about 260 feet from the building. He didn't growl. He didn't lower his body. He simply turned his head toward the structure and held it there. His enormous head tilted by a few degrees and remained completely still. Rook stopped with him. That was all the information he needed, and he needed nothing more. He sat behind a fallen pine and watched. A light was burning inside. Not a flashlight, not a flame. An electric lamp placed deep within the cannery, partially covered by something so that its glow escaped only through a few gaps in the sheet metal, forming thin horizontal lines. But it was steady. It didn't flicker, go dark, or change in intensity. A generator was running somewhere behind the building, its sound blending so closely with the waves that he had to sit motionless for 4 minutes before he could separate one from the other. People didn't bring a generator to a place they only visited. This wasn't a hideout. It was an office. Rook rose and circled wide, moving downwind, never crossing open ground, stopping at the edge of each tree before stepping toward the next. It took him 40 minutes to complete a circuit around a building an ordinary person could have circled in 8. He counted. 3 vehicles were parked by the loading bay, 2 pickup trucks and an old sedan. 6 silhouettes crossed the strips of light during the first 20 minutes, and a 7th appeared at minute 31, stepping outside to smoke before going back in. 7. 2 of them had something hanging at their waists that made their coats lift slightly when they turned. No one was guarding the outer perimeter. Rook recorded that detail, and he recorded in capital letters inside his mind. People left the perimeter unguarded for one of 2 reasons. Either they were stupid, or they knew with certainty that no one was coming. He didn't go inside. He never went in immediately, and he had survived 15 years because of that. He read the tire tracks in the wet mud, the flattened grass, the path where someone had cleared away broken branches. Not thoroughly, only enough for a pickup truck to pass, and those broken branches were still fresh. Then Bruno moved away from him. He walked slowly toward the western foundation and stopped before the mouth of an old drainage culvert, the kind built to carry rainwater from the concrete yard into the bay, now dry and filled with rotting leaves. He stood there and tilted his head. Rook approached. Inside the culvert, about 18 inches from the opening, several boards had been propped against one another, appearing at first like debris washed inside, though nothing drifted into a drain at that angle. He pulled them away. Behind them was a metal box, an old toolbox painted blue, with 2 rusted latches and a carrying handle. There was no dust on it. That was the only detail that mattered. Inside, a culvert filled with rotting leaves and spiderwebs was a box whose lid had been polished clean because someone opened it often. Rook pulled it out, placed it on the grass, and rested one hand on the lid. Bruno turned his head toward the road. Rook stopped. His hand remained on the toolbox, and he didn't move by even a fraction of an inch. In the distance, from the direction of the dirt road, 2 beams of headlights swept into view, passing once across the line of pines, and making the straight trunks seem to slide sideways across one another like the ribs of a folding fan. They stopped. The light remained perfectly still for 3 seconds. Then it went dark. He waited another 4 minutes after the headlights went dark before opening the lid. Inside, stacked neatly one on top of another like inventory in a warehouse, was money, bound with rubber bands and unmarked, and when he lifted one bundle, the smell rising from it was machine oil mixed with sea salt. The smell of money that had passed through the hands of dock workers before entering this box. Beneath the money was a package wrapped in oilcloth, and inside the oilcloth were 3 guns, not military weapons, merely illegal ones, their barrels shortened and their serial numbers ground away. Beneath those was a black portable hard drive sealed inside a zippered plastic bag, careful and orderly, the kind of care used by someone who knew they were protecting something worth more than all the money and guns combined. And at the very bottom, lying flat against the floor of the box, was a leather-bound ledger. Rook took it out and opened it beneath the light of the small lamp concealed inside his palm. It wasn't a record of debts, addresses, parcel numbers, acreage, boundaries. Beside every property was a name, and beside every name were handwritten notes. He turned the pages. Page 7, a name he didn't recognize, with the note, son in Ohio, calls twice a year. Page 9, has a lawyer in Bangor, high cost, leave until later. Page 11, Mrs. Fisk, no children, stubborn, Try the property first. He continued, turning. Page 14. Marin Quill. Beneath her name were 3 lines written by hand in blue ink, the lettering even, elegant, and slanted. No family, no lawyer, no one calls. And beneath those 3 lines, separated by a small space, was one more line, shorter than the others. Previous file, 2018. Rook read that page 3 times. Fog gathered on the shoulders of his coat, and he didn't notice. Then he stopped reading the words and began studying the handwriting, the way the letter I was written without a dot, the way the tail of the letter G extended downward before crossing itself, the perfectly consistent 15-degree slant across every page, the downward strokes heavier than the upward ones. He had been looking at this handwriting for 15 years, on receipts, in the margins of contracts, on a card sent to him 6 years earlier when his mother died, 3 handwritten sentences that he still kept. He closed the ledger. He returned everything to its exact former position, with the money on top, then shut the toolbox, pushed it back inside the mouth of the culvert, and propped the boards where they had been. He took nothing. He told no one. He walked back toward town with Bruno 5 paces ahead of him, and he didn't speak a single word during the entire 2.5 miles. By the time he reached the instrument workshop, it was 2 o'clock in the morning. He went directly to the sink in the corner, opened the faucet, and washed his hands. The water was cold enough to hurt. He washed them for a very long time, far longer than necessary, rubbing both hands together beneath the stream while staring straight at the brick wall in front of him. Then he shut off the faucet, dried his hands, and took out his phone. His voice was completely normal. "You stay here," he said. "Watch the instrument workshop. I don't want her alone tonight." The other end remained silent for half a second before Silas said, "All right." He arrived 20 minutes later, dragged a chair outside the door, and sat with his back against the brick wall, nodding once to Rook as he passed. He believed him. That was the only thing Rook needed. He had just tied the traitor to a chair 50 miles away from everything he needed to know, in a place where he couldn't see or hear anything, and the man had sat down in that chair on his own. Rook drove away. Inside the workshop, Marin rose from the workbench and went into the small bedroom at the rear. She pulled over a chair, climbed onto it, and took the tin box down from the top of the wardrobe. Outside the door, Silas tilted his head and looked through the gap. He watched her carry the box to the table. He watched her open it. He remained still and didn't take out his phone, because calling someone would mean explaining how he knew that box was important, and he sat there with both hands resting on his thighs while she turned through the papers one by one beneath the desk lamp. The death certificate lay at the bottom, folded into quarters, its edges worn soft and feathery from being opened and folded again 40 times. She unfolded it. Her sister's name, typed in capital letters, the date, the word accident. And in the lower left corner, on the line for the signature of the person who had determined the cause, was the name Billy Fisk had spoken the previous morning in the same tone someone used for a familiar pothole on the road home. She stared at it for a long time. Then her eyes moved to the right, toward the box she hadn't looked at once in 8 years, the small box at the bottom of the page labeled Witness. There was a signature inside it. Thin, trembling strokes leaning to the left, a hurried letter M followed by nothing more than a wavering line. Her own signature. 19 years old, 4 o'clock in the morning, a hospital corridor, fluorescent lights. Someone had handed her a stack of papers and a pen and told her to sign here, and here, and here as well. And she had signed. She had signed everything they placed in front of her, because that was all a 19-year-old person could do inside that corridor at that hour. She had signed the lie. 8 years earlier, and she didn't remember. When Rook returned, dawn was close, and she was sitting on the concrete floor among the pieces of wood, not the papers, because the papers had already been put away. Only the wood remained, and she was arranging the fragments into rows according to size. "Why didn't you hire someone to repair it?" he asked. She remained silent for a long time. "Because if someone finishes repairing it," she said, "I won't have a reason to come into this room anymore." Rook stood there for a while. Then he sat down on the concrete floor, a man wearing a $3,000 sweater, lowering himself onto the cold cement inside a workshop in Maine, and he began picking up the pieces of wood. He had done this once before, a very long time ago, in another room. At noon the following day, Fenwick Draycott sat inside his pawnshop with a peppermint in his mouth and called the police station, and he spoke the name he had heard from 3 different people within the past 18 hours. "There's a man from Boston walking around my town," he said. On the other end of the line, Hollis Parr was polishing his boots with a piece of felt, something he did every day, and he didn't stop moving when he heard the name. For 19 years, he had occupied that chair. For 19 years, no one had touched him. He listened to everything, then said, "He has no authority here." "I do." He ended the call and continued polishing his boots until they shone. Draycott didn't run. That was what a wise man would have done, and he didn't do it. He accelerated. He needed something in his hands before the net closed around him. He needed to prove to himself that this town still belonged to him, and the appointment he had scheduled for 3 days later was moved forward to that night. The Ashby brothers, Corwin, 71, and Dorsey, 69, owners of the narrow waterfront property at the end of Pike Road, were moved up 3 days on the schedule. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Odessa Hallow opened the door of her patrol car in the parking lot behind the station and found an envelope lying on the front seat. Her vehicle was locked. She stood looking at it for a while before getting inside. The envelope contained a small, unlabeled hard drive. She connected it to her laptop and opened it, and during the first 30 seconds, she stopped breathing. System logs, camera records, accesses, deletions, dates, times, account names. Then she began reading more carefully and recognized the second thing. The data had been cut apart. There were abruptly severed folder structures, paths leading to places where nothing remained, empty spaces left so cleanly that only someone acting deliberately could have made them. Someone had sat down with this information, separated out exactly the portion concerning Coldwater Bay, not one bite more, and given it to her. She remained inside the vehicle for a long time. Fog gathered on the windows. She understood precisely what was happening to her, that she was being used, that someone had decided exactly how much she needed to know and how much she didn't, and she sat with both hands on the steering wheel thinking about that for 14 minutes. Then she composed an email, attached the files, and pressed send. At the same time, inside the instrument workshop, Marin picked up the hardbound notebook from where it had lain on the floor for 2 nights and placed it on the workbench beneath the lamp. She opened it for the first time in 2 years. It wasn't a journal. It had never been a journal. It was a collection of 3-part carbon copy forms purchased from the Rockport office supply store, and every page was a carbon duplicate of an official report. Suspected elder abuse. The standard form issued by the state of Maine. Patient's name, date, time, diagnostic code, and a pre-printed line stating that the reported mechanism of injury was inconsistent with the clinical presentation. Submitted to the Coldwater Bay Police Department. The proper procedure, the law. It was the only place where the reports could be submitted. 11 forms, and each one had a box in the lower right corner, a printed rectangle with 3 small words above it. Receiving agency response. She turned the pages one at a time. Empty box, empty box, empty box, 11 empty boxes. She paused longer over the 3rd report. She remembered that one. After submitting it, she had gone to the station herself without an appointment, and Hollis Parr had risen from behind his desk, poured her a cup of coffee, pulled out a chair, and listened to her speak for 20 minutes, without interrupting once. He nodded in all the right places. He took notes. Then, when she finished, he set down his pen, folded his hands together, and asked in the warmest voice she had ever heard from him, "Do you have any evidence beyond instinct, Miss Quill?" On the 7th report was an address that sent a chill through her when she read it again that night. Cannery, Northern Point, 3:14 in the morning. One worker, he said a machine caused it. No machine there had operated in 5 years. And clipped to the final page, folded in half, was a letter. Thick paper, embossed heading, Maine State Board of Nursing, dated 2 years earlier. A complaint concerning inaccurate record-keeping. It stated that 11 reports appeared in Nurse Marin Quill's personal records for which the receiving agency possessed no corresponding copies. It stated that this raised questions about her professional integrity. Her license would remain valid under conditional status, given the absence of any replacement personnel in the region. She had done the right thing 11 times, and they had used those same 11 times to silence her. That was why she had stopped writing. She sat motionless beneath the desk lamp. At 11 o'clock that night, the telephone rang. Unknown number, she answered because she always answered. A man's voice, one she didn't recognize, panicked and breathless, with wind roaring behind him. "Someone's hurt at the cannery," he said. "Don't call the police." Then he hung up. At 11:20, the lights inside the cannery came on one by one, and the vast empty space emerged beneath a harsh yellow glare that struck the corrugated metal ceiling before falling into distorted pools across the cracked concrete floor. The pickup rolled through the loading bay and stopped near the old production line. 2 elderly men were brought out, Corwin, 71, and Dorsey, 69, 2 brothers wearing the same kind of coat, probably bought together 20 years earlier, their wrists bound with plastic ties. They were seated on 2 overturned wooden crates. Fenwick Draycott crouched in front of them, his elbows resting on his knees, and spoke in the tone someone might use to discuss the weather in a clinic waiting room. "You know why you're here," he said. "I've been patient. You haven't." Corwin raised his chin. "We aren't selling," he said. Draycott smiled and nodded as though he had just heard the correct answer to an entirely different question. Then he snapped his fingers. Orrin Ketch, thin, with ragged stubble and eyes that couldn't remain still for even a second, stepped forward and kicked an empty metal drum. It rolled across the concrete, struck a steel column, then continued rolling, and the crash multiplied throughout the hollow building, leaping to the metal roof, falling back down, and lingering for 7 seconds before it finally died. No one had been touched. That was the entire point. Dorsey flinched, his shoulders rising, and Draycott saw it, and that was what he needed. Fear was doing its work. Outside, about 130 feet from the loading bay, Rook lay flat behind a pile of rotting pallets, wet wood pressing into his forearms. He had been there since 9:30. 7 men. 2 carried something at their waists. 1 stood by the eastern waterside entrance, smoking his 3rd cigarette. The remaining 4 had grown careless from confidence. They spoke too loudly, stood with their backs to the doors, and had left the keys in the pickup's ignition. Bruno lay flattened beside him, 154 pounds pressed against the ground, his head resting on his front paws, his eyes never leaving the loading bay for even a second. Rook breathed slowly. He waited. He never hurried, and in 15 years, that patience had never made him pay a price. He had finished calculating everything by 10 o'clock. The rear door, 22 steps. The smoker would turn away when he lit his next cigarette. The second steel column blocked the view from where Draycott was crouching. 40 seconds, perhaps 35. The priority was clear, and there was only one. The 2 old men had to leave that building still able to walk. Everything else was secondary, including Draycott, including the ledger, including the name inside it whose handwriting he had recognized. Then he heard it, an old 4-cylinder engine, and the squeal of a belt at low revolutions, the sound heard only when a vehicle had traveled more than 186,000 miles, and its owner knew what was wrong, but couldn't afford to repair it. Rook raised his head less than an inch. It wasn't one of their vehicles. They drove pickups. All 3 were pickups, he had counted. Headlights cut through the final bend of the dirt road, casting long, shifting shadows through the pines that flickered against the dark like a row of turning blades. Then the lights went dark. There was no hard braking, no hurried slam of a door. The vehicle continued forward without its lights, slowly and carefully, driven by someone who knew the road and didn't want anyone to hear them coming. And Rook knew exactly who it was, because 30 minutes earlier, he had been sitting inside that vehicle. He had sat in the passenger seat with his knees touching the glove compartment whose latch was broken, and there had been a stethoscope hanging from the rearview mirror, 2 boxes of bandages, and an empty bottle of hand sanitizer on the floor behind him. And that belt had squealed in exactly the same way when she turned onto Ferry Street and told him she needed to return to the workshop, that she was fine, that he didn't need to take her anywhere. For 1 second, August Vance Rook stopped breathing. Nothing appeared on his face. He didn't move. Both hands remained on the wet pallet wood, and his eyes stayed fixed on the loading bay, but his chest stopped for 1 beat. Exactly 1 beat. And in 15 years no one had ever seen that happen. Not Silas Booth. Not even the people who had pointed guns at his face. Then he breathed again, and his entire plan, the 40-second plan he had assembled piece by piece during 2 hours spent lying on the frozen ground, had just become useless, because everything depended on there being no one within that space except him, the dog, 7 men, and 2 old brothers. Now there was a civilian within 130 feet. Bruno turned his head toward the road and held it there. Rook remained motionless, his eyes still fixed on the loading bay, and began calculating again from the beginning. She didn't sneak inside. That was the first thing Rook realized, and it chilled him more deeply than the wet earth beneath his body. She didn't switch off her headlights and circle through the pines, didn't crouch low, didn't press herself into the shadows of the stacked pallets. She walked straight into the loading bay between the two beams of light, the glare striking her face so directly that she had to narrow her eyes slightly, while the canvas bag slung over her shoulder tapped softly against her hip with every step. She crossed the concrete threshold, and she spoke in exactly the voice she had used for 4 years at people's doors at 2 o'clock in the morning, the calm voice that was neither high nor low, the voice of someone who had come to do her work. I heard someone was hurt. 7 men froze. Inside that hollow space, the only sound was the steady hum of the generator running somewhere behind the building. One man holding a bottle of water stopped with it halfway to his mouth. The man at the waterside door turned around with his cigarette still unlit, because they knew how to deal with a hero. They had trained for that. They had imagined it. They had a prepared script for a man kicking down the door, charging inside, and shouting at them to let their prisoners go. They had no script for a nurse walking between the headlights with a medical bag and asking who was hurt. Draycott rose from his crouch. It took him 3 seconds. "You should go home, sweetheart," he said. The same voice. The same voice he had used for 4 years whenever he stepped aside for her at the grocery store, whenever he asked whether the winter was treating her too harshly, the voice that had sent flowers after Wendell died. "Whether you called me or I came on my own, the result is the same," Marin said. She placed the bag on the concrete floor. "You choose." And during those 3 seconds, when all 7 men were looking at her instead of the rear entrance, Rook moved inside. The guard heard the rasping breath before he saw anything. It was the last sound he registered before 154 pounds appeared in the narrow passage between 2 stacks of crates. A gray mass separating itself from the darkness, and standing there, low and silent, its sagging head tilted by a few degrees. For half a second, the man didn't believe what he was seeing. Half a second was enough. Rook closed the distance using the old production line as cover, moving along its length, appearing from angles no one had watched, because no one believed a person could approach from there. One man struck a steel beam, then slid down it until he sat on the concrete with both legs stretched out, his eyes still open but seeing nothing. Another lost his breath and dropped to his knees, both hands pressed against the center of his chest, his mouth open without a sound emerging. A gun left someone's hand and slid across the concrete, spinning as it went, then disappeared beneath the conveyor belt. No one picked it up. No one had enough time even to think about picking it up. 2 men ran toward the eastern waterside entrance, and they ran quickly, turning into the narrow passage between 2 stacks of pallets, the only route leading out to the dock. Bruno was standing there. He didn't charge. He didn't growl. He simply stood in the middle of the passage, filling its entire width, 154 pounds of motionless gray skin beneath the headlights, and he didn't move. The 2 men stopped so abruptly that the one behind crashed into the back of the one in front. Then they both raised their hands. There were no gunshots. From beginning to end, not a single gunshot was fired inside that cannery. Rook walked to the 2 elderly men and took out his knife. He cut the plastic tie around Corwin's wrists, then Dorsey's, catching their arms as they fell. "Stand behind me," he said, his voice gentle. Marin had knelt beside her canvas bag. She opened it, she counted, she documented. 3 things, nothing more, and she performed them in the same order she had followed for 4 years inside cold kitchens, and her hands didn't shake once. Dorsey said something very softly, and she nodded. "I know. Keep your arm exactly like that," she said, taking hold of his wrist. Behind her, Rook straightened and looked at her, and in that moment, he understood what he had misunderstood during the 2 hours he had spent lying behind the pallets. She wasn't the person who needed to be rescued. She had never been the person who needed to be rescued. She was the diversion, and she had chosen to become the diversion, walking between the headlights with the bag on her shoulder because she knew with absolute certainty that 7 men would look at her for 3 seconds, and 3 seconds was what he needed. She knew exactly what she was doing. Draycott stepped backward once, then again, and stopped when his back struck the metal drum that had rolled across the floor. Draycott dropped to his knees before anyone told him to. He did it on his own, both knees striking the concrete, his hands raised beside his ears, and the peppermint fell from his mouth and rolled away. Then he began talking, though no one had asked him anything. "She wasn't my target," he said. "I inherited her. That workshop had been in the ledger for 8 years. I bought the list. I bought this entire territory. I only took over what other people left behind." Rook stood motionless. He didn't move closer. He didn't bend down. He simply stood beneath the headlights with both arms resting at his sides. "Who burned it?" he asked. "No one burned anything," Draycott said. That was an accident. It really was. Old wiring in a wooden building. It happens all the time. And the fire trucks? Rook asked. Draycott shrugged. Someone gave them the wrong address, he said. That happens too. He didn't smile. That was the worst part. Had he smiled, it could have been called cruelty. But he didn't. He merely shrugged like a man explaining why a delivery had arrived late, and there was nothing inside that shrug. No malice, no pleasure, nothing but the indifference of a man adding a number to a column. Her sister didn't make it out, he said. On the other side of the loading bay, Marin was bandaging Corwin's hand. Her hands didn't stop. The roll of gauze continued circling the old man's wrist, twice around, diagonally across the palm, then once more, and she cut it with the small scissors she always kept in the far right compartment of her bag. She didn't raise her head. She didn't make a sound, because that was the only thing her hands knew how to do when the world collapsed, the only thing left when 8 years were overturned in 7 seconds, and her hands continued their work without needing her. Draycott kept talking, because once he began, he couldn't stop. I didn't give anyone an order. I was only the buyer who took over. The person who wanted that property in 2018 was Parr. That waterfront parcel, he had been pursuing it for 3 years. He already had a buyer. All he needed was one signature. The girl who made instruments said no. She said no twice. Then Orrin Ketch began to cry. He sat heavily on the concrete with both hands bound behind his back, and he cried the way people cried after holding it in for 3 years. It wasn't my idea, he said. They told us it would be clean. They said the chief was behind it. Envelopes every month. I saw them myself. I delivered them with my own hands. They told us who wouldn't talk, who needed pressure, who had no one who would call. The words poured from him, his nose running, and then he spoke more softly, almost too quietly to hear. I called her. I didn't know who else to call. She was the only person who had ever come. Marin looked up. She stared at him across the headlight-washed concrete and recognized the voice. The panicked, breathless voice at 11 o'clock that night, with the wind roaring behind him. He had once been her patient, 3:14 in the morning, 2 years earlier, in this very place. Even on his knees, Draycott turned his head toward her. You should go home, sweetheart, he said. You have patients tomorrow morning. Rook straightened slowly. He took a small telephone from his inner pocket, the cheap plastic kind with no name stored in its contacts. He entered a number. He gave an address, spoke 2 sentences, and didn't give his name. Then he ended the call. He walked 7 steps to the edge of the dock and threw the telephone into the bay, and it made no sound worth noticing. 11 minutes. That was the number he had calculated. That was how long he needed to cover the dirt road, reach his vehicle, and make it to the highway. He looked back once. Marin was bent over with the bandage roll in her hand, her hair covering one side of her face, and she wasn't looking at him. Bruno was still standing in the narrow passage between the 2 stacks of pallets. Rook gave one very soft whistle, and the dog left his position, slowly, never hurrying, and followed him into the darkness. Sirens began to carry from the main road when he had been gone for 4 minutes. They were different this time. Not the broken, intermittent siren of the county patrol cars that everyone in Coldwater Bay knew by heart. These were longer, lower, and there was more than one vehicle. Federal agents. Rook was already gone. Marin wasn't. She remained. She finished bandaging Corwin's hand, then examined Dorsey, then sat beside Orrin Ketch as he cried and told him to breathe out longer than he breathed in. And that was why, when the first vehicles rolled into the loading bay, the first person they saw was a woman kneeling on the concrete beside an open canvas bag. And she wasn't the victim of anything. She was the witness. The message reached Silas Booth at 12:20. It contained 2 sentences and nothing else. It's done. Route 1, mile marker 40. He rose from the chair where he had spent the entire night outside the instrument workshop, rubbed both knees, and felt relieved. That was how it ended, he thought. August tore up the papers. The pawnshop owner understood. Everyone returned to Boston, and this rotten town sank back into the fog the way it always had. He drove out to the highway and took himself to the meeting point. The black vehicle was already parked at mile marker 40, its taillights glowing red through the fog, and Rook sat motionless behind the wheel. Silas opened the door and climbed into the passenger seat, bringing the cold and the smell of cigarettes with him. He leaned back and released a long breath. He believed he was still safe. He had every reason to believe it. He had watched the workshop all night, He could name every vehicle that had passed along Ferry Street, and the exact time each one had gone by. He hadn't been at the cannery. He hadn't heard a single siren. And most important of all, he didn't know that 40 minutes earlier, Fenwick Draycott had dropped to his knees on a concrete floor and begun talking without anyone asking him a question. "Is it done?" he said. Rook shifted into gear and pulled away. He didn't look over. "Your handwriting is better than I expected," he said. Silas said nothing. There was no music inside the vehicle, no radio, only the sound of tires moving over wet pavement and the ventilation fan running at its lowest setting. The headlights cut about 50 feet into the fog before dissolving into a white wall. 2 miles passed, then 4. Silas sat motionless with both hands resting on his thighs, and he didn't turn his head toward Rook even once, exactly as he had walked past the brightly lit kitchen doorway at Mossbacher Funeral Home that night, without glancing inside. $7,000, Rook said. Was that her price? For a long time, neither man spoke. The windshield wipers made one pass, then stopped. "I have a daughter in Portland," Silas said. "You know that." "I know," Rook said. He added nothing. He didn't ask how old she was, where she studied, or how much she needed, because he already knew all of it. He had signed the checks for her tuition 3 years in a row and had never mentioned it, and both men inside the vehicle knew that, and neither of them said it aloud. Rook slowed down. "It wasn't the vehicle. It was his voice. That's why you're still breathing," he said. Silas closed his eyes. The vehicle stopped in the middle of the highway, not on the shoulder, not in a turnout, but directly in the center of the lane, because in fog this thick there were no road markings left to respect, and no other vehicle in the world. Rook left the engine running. He didn't take anything from his pocket. He didn't turn toward Silas. He merely sat with both hands on the steering wheel, looking into the white wall ahead of the hood. Silas remained still for a while. He meant to say something. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, because 15 years beside this man had taught him that there were moments when one more sentence could take away the last thing a person still possessed. He removed his gloves and placed them on the dashboard, carefully folded in half, the gesture of a man returning a set of keys. Then he opened the door. Cold air flooded inside. He stepped onto the road and stood there, and he didn't close the door immediately. He kept one hand on the frame for another 2 seconds. 15 years ended in a single sentence. Then he shut the door softly, the way someone closes the door to a room where another person is sleeping. Rook shifted into gear. He drove away and didn't look in the mirror. Had he looked, the rear-view mirror would have shown only fog and a shadow standing in the middle of the highway, growing fainter with every second until nothing remained. He didn't look. He drove south with both hands positioned correctly on the steering wheel and the speedometer holding precisely at 55 miles an hour, and in the back seat, Bruno released a rasping breath and lowered his chin. Behind them, 20 miles away, a town was awakening beneath blue and red lights, sweeping across curtains that had remained tightly drawn for 4 years. And inside that town, one man was still sitting in his office with his polished boots beneath the desk, not yet understanding what was happening. Morning arrived without fanfare. 2 unmarked vehicles rolled into Coldwater Bay at 6:10, their tires whispering over pavement still damp with sea mist, and not a single siren sounded. The town didn't wake because of noise. It woke because doors opened softly, because measured footsteps crossed the sidewalks, because of the quiet authority of people who didn't need to raise their voices. Inside the temporary command room set up in the old town hall, Prudence Miller, 44 years old, stood with her coat draped neatly over the back of a chair, her short fair hair close to her head, and she looked at the things spread across the table with the expression of someone who had passed through too many towns hollowed out from within. "This isn't a gang," she said quietly. "It's a business." There were 2 things on the table: a hard drive, its data cut down with surgical precision until only the Coldwater Bay portion remained, broken paths pointing into nothingness in a way any technician would recognize as deliberate, and a hardbound book of 3-part carbon copy forms, handwritten, 11 pages, each one a report of suspected elder abuse, with the full submission date written in the upper corner. Miller placed them side by side. She opened the system logs on the screen, then turned through the book, her index finger moving down both columns as she compared them. 11 submission dates, 11 deletions. A match, 1 day at a time. Not approximately, not within the same week, the same day. One differed by only 40 minutes. She looked up at the woman sitting across the table. "You have the copies," she said. Someone else has the deletions. By itself, what you have only proves you wrote the reports. By itself, the hard drive only proves someone erased them. When the two meet, that proves intent. Maren said nothing. She had been awake for 30 hours, and the marks from the restraints were still visible on her wrists. No one in that room had won alone, and everyone present knew it. By noon, the truth was no longer a rumor. Fenwick Draycott was led out of his pawnshop in handcuffs, his face emptied of the kindly expression he had worn for 4 years. Hollis Parr was sitting alone when they entered. He said nothing when they placed the warrant on his desk. He didn't resist when they took his gun. The boots that had once shone so brightly now bore a long scrape across one toe, and no one knew where it had come from. His 2 deputies followed before sunset. They were led away past townspeople who watched in silence, and there was no triumph in that silence. No whistles, no one throwing anything. There was only a grave clarity, the expression of people who had finally seen the name of the thing they had lived beside for 4 years without ever daring to call it what it was. Ilsa Pemberton stood outside the bakery with her apron in her hands instead of around her waist. This time, she didn't draw the curtains. She watched. She watched from beginning to end, and when the final vehicle passed, she remained there for a long while. Maren stood in front of Parr when they brought him down the steps. She didn't block his path. She merely stood beside it and asked one question. "Do you remember my sister's name?" Parr stared straight at the wall ahead. He didn't turn his head even a single degree. His jaw tightened and remained that way. "That's an answer," Maren said. She turned away, then she stopped. "Theodora," she said. "You'll hear it every day for the next 20 years. Later, when everything was finished, Miller handed her a sheet of paper and spoke about the fire investigator, the name in the lower left corner of the death certificate. "He retired last year," Miller said. "Lives in Florida." She paused. Not for much longer. Rook was nowhere to be seen during any of it. Miller met him that afternoon, alone, at the edge of the southern waterfront, in a place where she had no authority, and they both knew it. "You aren't clean, mister." "Rook," she said. "No," he said. "Then why?" He looked out over the bay, where the water was gray as tin, and a boat was heading toward the mouth. "Because there are things worse than crime," he said. "Crime wearing a badge." She studied him for a long time. "Someone called us last night," she said. "The number couldn't be traced." Rook said nothing. "I'll come back here," she said. "For you. One day." "I know," he said. He put on his hat. "Do the work you came to do. That's enough." She nodded. "Usually it is," she said. Weeks passed, and the ice along the edge of the dock melted, and the gray bay changed color every afternoon, in ways only those who had lived there all their lives knew how to read. Rook stood inside the instrument workshop on one such afternoon, facing the glass case in the corner, and asked her about what lay inside. 1,400,000, he said. "Enough to pay every debt in a single day, with enough left for you to live 10 years without going anywhere. It can't be sold," Maren said. She wiped her hands on a cloth, slowly, one finger at a time. "My sister bought it through Draycott. He financed the purchase, and he never delivered the provenance documents. Without those papers, it's nothing at all. Just an old wooden box no one dares to buy, and no one dares to sell." Rook stood still. He understood the trap in exactly 2 seconds, and he understood it more completely than she did, because he had built traps like it himself, priceless and useless at the same time. That was why Draycott needed her signature, not the instrument. The instrument was only the cord tying her to the property, and the property was what he had wanted from the beginning. "Then why keep it?" he asked. "Because they wanted it," she said, "and it was the only thing I could refuse them." Theodora's instrument rested on the workbench. 19 old pieces, 3 new ones, the purfling misaligned by about 1/50th of an inch at the waist, where any craftsman would notice it immediately, and a crack running diagonally across the soundboard that she had deliberately left visible beneath the varnish. And near the neck was a small piece of spruce, the final piece, the 23rd, which she couldn't remember finding. She had searched the concrete floor for it with a flashlight 3 nights in a row and found nothing. Then one morning, it was lying on the workbench. She drew the bow across the strings. It made a sound. Not the sound Theodora would have drawn from it. The tone was slightly dark, slightly choked in the lower register, and anyone with a trained ear would have known immediately that the instrument had been pieced together by someone who wasn't a craftsman. But it made a sound. Across the street, Merle Tatum's diner remained open late for the first time in 4 years. and yellow light spilled onto the sidewalk at 7 o'clock in the evening. A warm pool resting on the wet pavement. Wren, Merle's 7-year-old granddaughter, ran across the street because she heard the music. She rose onto her toes to peer through the workshop window, both hands pressed against the glass. Marin opened the door and placed the bow in the child's hand, and Wren drew out one note, long, crooked, and so piercing that Bruno opened one eye before closing it again, and she giggled and played another. Before, no one had allowed children outside after dark. Rook stood in the doorway with his coat draped over one arm. "The crack is still there," he said. "Yes," she said. She set the instrument down. "It doesn't disappear, but now it's part of the sound instead of the thing that ruins the sound." She was silent for a while. "I used to think that if I finished repairing it, I would somehow repay my sister for something. I was wrong. I don't owe her. I only miss her. Those are two different things, and it took me 8 years to understand that." She looked down at his hand, at the ring on his little finger, and asked him about it. He looked out the window. "My mother," he said. "Boston." She had spent a long time in the hospital, and every night after work he had sat there on a plastic chair in the 4th-floor corridor. "There was a nurse on the night shift," he said. "She never said anything. She only sat there. 3 hours. Every night for 5 weeks." He paused. "I never learned her name." He hadn't driven 3 hours through the fog to save anyone. He had come to assess the damage, but he hadn't turned the car around, and now she knew why. "The debt has been erased," he said. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," she said. A silence passed between them. "But you'll come back, won't you?" He didn't answer. He walked toward the door, and at the threshold, without turning around, he said, "Don't lock the door. No one is coming." It was the gentlest thing he had ever said. The next morning, Marin opened the workshop door and found Bruno lying on the front step. No note, no Rook. The dog raised his head and looked at her, his eyes calm and unwavering. She sat beside him on the step and placed her hand on that enormous head, and then her hand did what it had always done. It searched for a pulse. It counted, and she stopped. She counted again. Slow, too slow. The dog was 11 years old, and dogs of his breed lived an average of 7 to 9 years. Rook hadn't given her a protector. He had entrusted her with his final patient, because he didn't know how to sit beside Bruno when the time came. He had never known how, but he knew someone who did. In Boston, a man sat inside a room overlooking the harbor, beside an empty rug he hadn't replaced, and waited for the telephone to ring. He would return. They both knew exactly when. If this story stays with you, even for a little while, please leave a like. That's how we know we should continue. Share it with someone who needs to hear that fear never gets the final word. And if you believe in stories of courage and quiet strength, subscribe to our channel to hear more compelling stories every day. How did Marin and August Rook's story make you feel? Which detail stayed with you the longest? Was it the 11 empty boxes, or the night she walked between 2 beams of headlights and said, "I heard someone was hurt"? We would truly love to read the thoughts you share from the depths of your heart in the comments, because every story only truly lives when someone carries it forward. We wish everyone watching this video excellent health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.